Hey everybody, Dr. Snellgrove here, just recording a quick video for our chapter 16, sentence fragments. And the reason that I think it'll be a quick video, it's not just it's a short chapter in our book, but sentence fragments are something that you've already been dealing with in previous chapters. So much of this, I think may feel almost more like a reminder, a reiteration of some stuff you already know. So let's dive into it. It starts on page 350, but as usual, the meat potatoes don't start until the next page, 351. And they give you a pretty basic, what is a sentence fragment? Well, it's an incomplete sentence. And I think you've heard me say in multiple videos before, what do you need for a complete sentence? You need subject, verb, complete thought. And so basically, if we are lacking, one or more of these elements, we probably got a sentence fragment we're dealing with. So there's some pretty basic examples on 351. The first one says, many animals hibernate in winter, period. That's fine. Subject, verb, complete thought. The next one, including woodchucks, ground squirrels, and frogs. Okay, wait, that, by itself, that doesn't really work as a sentence, including woodchucks, ground squirrels, and frogs. That clearly was meant to be attached to the previous sentence. It can't stand on its own. Here's another example. On Saturday morning, Danielle spent an hour hiking a snowy trail. That's, again, subject, verb, complete thought. It's all good. But then the next part, with her two border collies, Bandit and Molly. It's like, all right, well, that by itself, with her two border collies, Bandit and Molly, is an incomplete sentence. We don't know who we're talking about. We don't know what they're doing. It's just floating information. All right, on the bottom half of 351, we start getting into some specific types of fragments. So a dependent clause fragment is a pretty common one. So we've talked about dependent clauses before, right? Dependent clauses are also incomplete. This is what I mean when I say this chapter may feel like, yeah, I've heard this before. So dependent clause by definition does not have subject, verb, complete thought. It can't be a sentence on its own. It needs to be attached to an independent clause in order to have a complete sentence. So the bottom of 351 is just describing, like, what if you had something that was clearly a dependent clause, but you tried to turn it into a sentence on its own. And so we can look at some examples here. Like, Jared did not finish his term paper. That's fine, subject, verb, complete thought. Because his computer crashed. Well, because his computer crashed does not work, as a complete sentence. That's just a fragment. We have another example here. When Alice arrived at 10:15. You're like, well, what happened when Alice arrived at 10:15? So these are the fragments that are, leave you wanting more. And I think I've had some previous videos where we talked about you can almost, verbally or auditorially recognize a dependent fragment, dependent clause, because it's almost the equivalent of somebody walking away without finishing a sentence, right? Imagine you're talking to somebody and they're like, because his computer crashed, and they don't say anything else. Right? What happened because his computer crashed? Or if you're like, when Alice arrived at 10:15. Okay, what happened when Alice arrived at 10:15? You are leaving us hanging. So dependent clauses, have to be completed. We have to have an independent clause attached to them to have an actual sentence. And obviously, dependent clauses cannot be sentences on their own. They are just fragments. And this should feel like deja vu all over again, but if you need a refresher, on the top of 352, we have commonly used dependent words like after, if, since, unless, because, et cetera, et cetera. And I say deja vu all over again because we previously talked, I believe, about how you could take what was previously an independent clause and actually turn it into a dependent clause. If you take the shortest sentence in the Judeo-Christian Bible, Jesus wept. It's subject, it's verb, it's complete thought, clear, easy to understand. But then you can pop these guys in front of it. After Jesus wept, although Jesus wept, because Jesus wept, until Jesus wept, once Jesus wept. Like, well, now we've created a dependent clause that can't stand on its own. All right. And on page 353, we get to something, verbal phrase fragments. And so this is honestly, it's obviously involving verbs and verbal phrases, but this has a lot of shared DNA to what we were just talking about, because once again, these are functionally like dependent clauses where we're waiting for more information to come in. So let's look at some examples on the bottom half of 353. To ensure that we would not forget to tip him. Okay, that obviously can't be, a sentence on its own. We need the rest of that sentence. So, and you can see there that they recommend fixing that by simply replacing the period with a comma. To ensure we would not forget to tip him, comma, the server asked, do you want change back? Here's another example. The auto repair shop has begun to open on weekends. So that's fine. Subject verb complete thought. To accommodate customers who work during the week. Well, that doesn't, that doesn't work. And like I said, this feels a lot like what we were just talking about, the idea of somebody almost like trailing off mid-sentence. To accommodate customers who work during the week. Well, what? What are you doing to accommodate these workers? Like, what information do we have on that whatsoever? All right. On 354, bottom half of 354, we get into a related issue here. Fragments with ing fragments. What the heck does this mean? All right. So this is when a sentence starts out with a verb, usually ending in ing, and it's like, okay, but then they forget to finish it. So like I said, all of this is going back to the idea of a dependent clause. So let's look at an example. Peering out the window and checking her watch every 5 minutes. Okay, that doesn't work. I mean, there's a lot of reasons that doesn't work, but maybe top of the list, we don't even know what is the subject of this sentence. We only get that from the next sentence here. Charlene waited for her guest to arrive. So as before, we recommend putting a comma at the end of that dependent clause, and then we have an independent clause after it to finish the thought. Peering out the window and checking her watch every 5 minutes, comma, Charlene waited for her guest to arrive. Here's another example. Rachel spent the afternoon at home. That's fine. But then listening to streaming radio and reading magazines. It's like, okay, that by itself cannot be a sentence. Listening to streaming radio and reading magazines. Imagine somebody walked up to you and said that. You're expecting them to finish the sentence. Your readers are expecting you to finish the sentence as well. And then they point out that sometimes, not always and not often even, but sometimes the ing word could be the second or third word in the fragment. And so here's another negative example. We got James hopped into his car and left the restaurant's parking lot. That's fine. Subject, verb, complete thought. But right after it, not realizing that he had left his bucket of chicken on the roof of the car. Oh man, I got to tell you, I'm a pretty big boy. That sounds like even worse than leaving my phone up there. Kentucky Fried cell phone. But yeah, not realizing that he had left his bucket of chicken on the roof of the car. It's incomplete. Imagine, I keep coming back to it, but imagine somebody said that and only that to you. You'd be like, is that seriously the end of the story? All right. And then we get into one more of these. So it's talking about fragments involving words ending in ed and en, and it's the same thing, So here's a negative example: spaced evenly and set in rows. Period. Well, that doesn't work. What is spaced evenly and set in rows? Like, we don't even have a subject here. So that is dependent. It needs to have an independent clause to fix it. So in this case, or complete it. Spaced evenly and set in rows, comma, the desk seemed ready for the fall term. Let's see here. Oh, I'm kind of amazed we got this deep into the book and this deep into the semester before this came up super explicitly. But they have a helpful reminder here. Basically says that if you have a dependent clause and then an independent clause, we always have to have a comma at the end of the dependent clause, and then the independent clause finishes the thought. But if you have an independent clause and then a dependent clause you attach to it, no comma, is needed. So we have that example kind of middle bottom on page 355. Everyone looked at the white rabbit. That's fine, subject verb, we thought. Held by the top-hatted magician. Okay, held by the top-hatted magician is not a sentence in and of itself. It needs to be attached to the previous sentence. And in their example, you attach them. You don't have to have a comma or anything else. And I know I say this all the time. You're probably already sick of hearing of it. But once again, you say this stuff out loud. It doesn't work all the time, but I'd say clear 80% of the time, you say something out loud, you would put, say, a comma where you would naturally put a pause, and vice versa. You would not put a comma where you normally would not put a pause. So imagine somebody saying, everyone looked at the white rabbit held by the top-hatted magician. Why did you pause right in the middle of there? But, if we turned this around, and you had a dependent clause followed by an independent clause, you would normally pause, and therefore you would normally put a comma in there. So I might say that, like, after the top-hatted magician pulled a rabbit out of the hat, everyone stared at him. So after the magician, pulled a rabbit out of his hat, that's a dependent clause. I have to put a comma at the end of it before I get to the independent clause. But again, if you just say this stuff out loud, you're putting commas where you would put pauses. All right, and I think we have just one more of these. On the corner stood Antoine, drenched by rain and looking miserable. So drenched by rain and looking miserable is not a sentence in and of itself. We got to complete it. So if you just connect it to the previous sentence, this is an example of what we were just talking about. On the corner stood Antoine, comma, drenched by rain and looking miserable. So we started with the dependent clause, ended it with a comma, finished the thought with an independent clause. All right. So on 357, we get into I guess you might call this a more substantial issue, perhaps, when you're making fragments. Like, what if we just don't have it says fragments beginning with joining words like and, or, but, or then, followed by a verb are missing subject fragments. And that's exactly what it sounds like. Something that might have been a complete sentence if we had a damn subject in there. So let's look at this example here. A very timely example, since we're keeping an eye on this upcoming hurricane. The hurricane changed course and seemed to falter. That's fine, subject verb complete thought, but gathered strength again before it hit the coast. All right, we're literally missing a single word there. That second bit, all we need is something like it, but it gathered strength again before it hit the coast. That would be our subject, but without a subject, we just got a fragment. Here is another. Oh, well, I guess another way to fix that. The book is like, the hurricane changed course and seemed to falter, but gathered strength. So obviously you can turn this into one big sentence like we've been doing, or if you keep it as a separate sentence, you can fix it by adding the subject. I know that's, you come to me for these great lessons, right? You can fix the missing subject problem by adding a subject. All right. And to be fair, the book also has a second example there too. All right, here's another one. Woodrow held up his prize fish and posed for the camera. That's fine. Subject, verb, complete thought. Then fell off the end of the fishing pier. All right, well, it's deja vu all over again. We need to fix this. And once again, there are two primary ways of fixing it. The easiest one is to just replace that period with a comma, and then the dependent clause bit is finishing the thought. Woodrow held up his prize fish and posed for the camera, comma, then fell off the end of the fishing pier. But if you wanted to keep it two sentences, you could always be like, then he fell off the end of the fishing pier. The important point is, as always, we need subject, verb, complete thought. All the ingredients for a complete sentence. All right. So on the bottom half of 358, we talk about example and exception fragments. And so these are, they say they often begin with things like such as, including, like, for example, for instance, that would be example fragments. And then exception fragments begin with not, except, unless, without, in spite of, et cetera, et cetera. And so once again, the book is being very thorough, which is good, but it's covering all these scenarios, but it always comes back to, hey, it's easiest just to connect these guys together. So here's another negative example. Hollis becomes nervous in high pressure situations. That's fine, subject, verb, complete thought. Such as exams and interviews. It's like, okay, such as exams and interviews doesn't work as a sentence. What is our subject even? So we just put a comma there. Hollis becomes nervous in high pressure situations, comma, such as exams and interviews. Here's another one. Lindsay is trying to put herself through college. That's fine, subject, verb, complete thought. Without any help from her parents. All right, without any help from her parents is another, dependent clause. It's a fragment. Easiest way to fix it is just to join these sentences together. And like we talked about before, no comma would be necessary there. So Lindsay's trying to put herself through college without any help from her parents. All right, here's one last one here. Classes with labs require more time than other classes. That's fine, subject, verb, complete thought. For example, biology and French. That's a clear fragment, right? Like, again, just imagine someone comes up to you, for example, biology and French. Your instinct would be, what are we even talking about? And yeah, that's the problem. You need to connect that to the previous sentence. Classes with labs require more time than other classes, comma. For example, biology and French take more of my study time than history or math. All right, I think we have literally just one more section. So this is on page 360, prepositional phrase fragments. And I guess I've been grading a long time. I feel like these errors are rarer than some of the other errors student writers could make, but they're obviously not impossible here. And so prepositional phrase fragment is exactly what it sounds like, where somebody has a prepositional phrase and they're trying to treat it as a sentence. So they have a rather extreme example here near the top of 360. Hamilton finally found his lost history book. That's fine, subject, verb, complete thought. In a large mud puddle on the street beside the student union. So for those keeping track at home, that's technically 3 different prepositional phrases jammed together. In a large mud puddle on the street beside the student union. So it's 3 prepositional phrases. You can string all the prepositional phrases in the world together. They can't function as a sentence on their own because we don't have either a subject or a verb here, right? So once again, you can fix things by just combining these 2. Hamilton finally found his lost history book in a large mud puddle on the street beside the student union. Fine, perfect. And here's another negative example. This time we finally start with the incorrect bit. On her way to a 3 o'clock job interview at Stanfield Corporation. Okay, that's, on her way, at Stanfield Corporation. We have these prepositional phrases, but we are still missing, like, there's no verb, right? We also don't know who we're talking about. So the next bit is Melanie became lost. Once again, we can just mix these guys together and we'll have a comma at the end of the dependent clause. So on her way to a 3 o'clock job interview at Stanfield Corporation, comma, Melanie became lost. All right. So that's it for this section. I think you guys know the drill by now. If you have any questions, feel free to email. Feel free to text me at 863-835-2399. And y'all have a good one. Bye.